Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. I understand there's a general strike today of some sort. Every day, ICE, Border Patrol, and other enforcers of Trump's racist agenda are going into our communities to kidnap our neighbors and sow fear. It's time for us all to stand up together in a nationwide shutdown and say enough is enough, exclamation point, from the National Shutdown Campaign's website. I'm not familiar with their work, but I am familiar with the attitude. National shutdown. Absolutely no work, no school, no shopping. Today, January 30th. Stop funding ICE and demand ICE out everywhere. And as Hakeem Jeffries did, demand that Kristi Noem be put on ICE permanently, whatever that Tony Soprano impersonator meant by that. No work, no school, no shopping. Gosh, if there was no work and no school, particularly no school, would you even notice the difference in the Chicago public school system? There are so few students matriculating in those warehouses these days. It was the topic of a conversation that BLM Brandon Johnson had this week, the new and exciting episode of Firing Line. What a get by Margaret Hoover, get Brandon Johnson. When he is not busy protecting us from the extreme right that wants to refight the Civil War. So if we want to refight the Civil War and we were the abolitionist side, then what does that make Brandon Johnson's side? Anyway, I digress. When he's not writing point on that matter, he is talking about the great strides that are being made in the Chicago public school system. There's more work to do, as there always is. Not today because it's a general strike, but, on other days. But it's going very well. He's not just a toady of the teachers union. They're allied together to build a better, bigger, stronger, safer Chicago.
You mentioned you were a social studies teacher. Chicago's public school system is also nearly $10 billion in debt. But enrollment is really far down from pre-COVID levels. Last year, 2 in 5 Chicago teachers were chronically absent, according to one report by the Illinois Policy Institute. After taking office, even the New York Times described you as, quote, almost unequivocally adopting the teachers union agenda. Is higher pay and more staff what's needed in the Chicago public schools right now?
Investment. That's what's needed in our public schools. And that's what's needed in our public schools across America. Look.
But is only investing in teachers' salaries the way to do that?
That's part of it. But, what we've done here in Chicago, we've invested in special education. We've invested in reducing class sizes. We've invested in what I believe is the model for the rest of this country, sustainable community schools, which provides real local autonomy for individual schools within communities that have unique challenges. 70% of the people of this state say that we need more funding for our public schools. In fact, when you look at that across this country, people overwhelmingly know that we have to invest more in our public schools. And so I'm not going to accept this frame that's coming from extremism in this country that somehow paying educators, whom, by the way, are overwhelmingly women, paying them a fair wage is somehow a problem. It's not. Investing in our educators, investing in our families,
that's right.
That's the best thing that we can do to protect and secure our democracy.
Since Chicago public school teachers are the highest paid teachers in the country, adjusted for cost of living, average will be $130,000 by the end of this contract. And most of them are women. That means, by definition, they are beyond reproach, and we can't talk about the money versus the product. Got it. Yeah. He's right, too. I mentioned this before, earlier the week, about reducing class sizes. They've invested in reducing class sizes. And look at the results. Let me give you an example. In 2023, at Douglas Academy High School, they invested $68,000 of spend per pupil, and they've driven the annual student enrollment down to 35 students at Douglas Academy High School, where the high school has a capacity of 912. See how they invested in reduced class sizes? And I'll tell you, when you got capacity for 912 and you only have 35 students enrolled, that really reduces the class size. And it only costs 68 grand per kid. Oh, by the way, the proficiency in reading at Douglas Academy High School in 2023 was 0% of the students. That's investing in education. For more on the topic, pleased to be joined by at least somebody who's adjacent to right-wing extremism, I think. Per Brandon Johnson's definition. Paul Vallas, Senior Policy Advisor at Illinois Policy Institute, writes weekly for the Chicago Contrarian. Obviously, of course, as you know, former CEO of CPS and former candidate for mayor. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Here's some numbers for you. They're spending $33,000 per student. They have one employee for every 7.2 kids, and they have 23,000 non-teachers. In other words, they have 12,000 more non-teachers than the city of Chicago has tops, and their test scores are abysmal, absolutely abysmal. So at the end of the day, if you recall, I think you've talked about this, the state had to change the testing cut scores to, in fact, lower the cut scores so that they could. It was the only way they could get the test scores to improve. Even with the lower cut scores,
that's what we call meeting people where they are, Paul.
That's right. It's all what's it called? The rising tide lifts all boats. Well, guess what? When you lower the tide, all boats get marooned, and that's what's happening in the Chicago public schools.
Yeah, more like draining the lake. And the return on investment here in CPS that you're talking about, and all those administrative employees. Well, you have to understand. You have a lot of it's 85% plus minority student population. Right. They have been systematically and systemically victims of racism. And so they need wraparound services in the school because right-wing extremists like me have destroyed the west and south sides of Chicago. So they need wraparound services. Thus, all those administrative personnel, to ensure that the whole student is being looked after. Because as Stacey Davis Gates famously said, we do treat these kids as our kids.
Yeah, well, let me point out. Look, the schools are so bad. Almost 40% of the teachers send their kids to private schools, and probably an equal number find a way to get their kids in select enrollment schools. As you know, Stacy sends one of her kids to a private school. I don't think any of the mayor's kids go to a school in his neighborhood, so he's taking advantage of the magnet programs. Incidentally, they eventually want to phase out the magnet programs and phase out the magnet schools because they offer a contrast and test and performance that embarrasses the so-called sustainable community schools. All the sustainable community schools they have right now, the ones that they want to expand, are failing. They are all academically failing. It's just a plot to fund more money to these schools. Look, the teachers union is now a far left, radical left political party. They've abandoned standards. They've returned to social promotion. They passed the board directed that they not rank schools by test scores anymore. They don't want the parents to know how badly their schools are going. And they're simply socially promoting kids into the next grade level. That's why they've lost 114,000 students since I left the system in 2001. Our enrollment actually grew by almost 40,000 during that period of time. So, you might as well put your money in a shredder because that's essentially what's happening. And as you know, they were promoting this kind of get kids out of school on Friday, and they need to be part of this Friday strike. Let me point out that this is the same teacher union that forced the district to keep schools closed for 78 consecutive weeks after COVID hit, when long after most of all the private schools had opened and parochial schools. And during that 78 consecutive weeks, when incidentally hundreds of Chicago teacher union teachers and other employees were going on junkets to to Hawaii and to Egypt and to their favorite destination, Las Vegas. If you remember, Caracas. If you remember when that happened, during that period of time, during those 2 years, over 900 kids were shot in the city of Chicago. Kids who were out of school, and over 100 were killed. And the union was directly responsible for literally a 50% increase in school-age youth murders and school-age youth being shot. So at the end of the day, this union ought to be decertified.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, that which you got to, which I want to focus on. We talk a lot about these data points, including money and test scores and phony graduation rates and proficiencies. But what we're really talking about, it's not so much the money. It's that you have, now it used to be 400,000 kids. Now it's maybe, 275. But that's still a huge number of children, the overwhelming majority of which who are going to be relegated and are every cycle to second-class citizen status permanently, not because of their color, but because of their lack of skill sets. They never even had the opportunity to earn a quality education. And that seems to me where we need to have the focus. This is a system that is in the business actually of destroying lives, sacrificing children on the pyre of the salaries and benefits and conveniences of the adults. And I just don't think it gets talked about enough, on those human terms.
Yeah, Dan, and what's lost in all this is the people that are suffering the most are children from low-income families, and the overwhelming vast majority of the low-income families in the city and in the schools are Black and Latino. I have said that the Chicago Teachers Union have created an apartheid school system, because if you are low-income, you're most likely stuck in a failing school. They're trying to wipe out charters. They're certainly working to degrade them. They already capped the number of public charter schools. They're trying to get rid of the magnet schools. And, of course, they killed the state scholarship program for poor parents who send their kids to parochial schools. And now they're refusing to opt into the federal program, which, according to Arnie Duncan, of all people, has said could generate about $1 billion in private donations that would be able to go to families to not only pay for their children's tuition, but also to pay for a tutor, to pay for early childhood education, special education support. The union is pressing Pritzker to opt out of a program that's going to literally get families, not the schools, the families themselves, as much as $1 billion statewide. And they're going to do it because they can't control the money and because they do not want to empower parents, certainly not poor parents, certainly not poor Black and Latino parents.
No, they protect the system at the expense of the kids, because the system is how they derive the benefits. If the system gets diluted, then they're the ones who are jeopardized. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. They understand where their bread is buttered. There's no question about it. It's just unfortunate that, as Brandon Johnson actually mentioned, such a large percentage of the population in Chicago and, frankly, north of I-80 doesn't seem to understand it.
Yeah, it is absolutely amazing. And look, every single time I hear Brandon talk about his teaching experience, he lasted 3 years in an elementary school, Jenner, which I built, by the way, and then he lasted 1 year in Westinghouse. And the reason he joined the union was because he was going to get fired. He was such a bad teacher that, the only thing keeping them from firing him was basically his support within the union. Stacey Davis Gates, who really runs him and tells him what to do, she was a failed teacher in her own right. I think she lasted barely 6 years. Coincidentally, Randy Weingarten, who is, of course, the grand dame of the American Federation of Teachers, is another failed teacher. I think they lasted 5 to 6 years. So you have these failed, disastrous teachers gravitating to positions of leadership, and now they're at least in the city of Chicago, the CTU is the tail that wags the dog.
Yeah, well, as the old saying goes, those who can't become a union boss or a politician. I wanted to get your reaction to the responses from the leading Dem Socialist Senate candidates the other night at their debate. I'm talking about Congresswomen Robin Kelly and Raja Krishnamoorthy, and then of course Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. When they were asked about, will you support Brandon Johnson's reelection, and they said they all sort of hemmed and hawed and bobbed and weaved. They had some compliments to say. They were open-minded about supporting Brandon Johnson's reelection, but they certainly didn't want to commit to it. How should we interpret the responses we heard from those Senate candidates?
I think their refusal to even comment should disqualify each of them. Each of them, absolutely. I mean, and look, it's not so much they're afraid of Brandon; they're afraid of the Chicago Teachers Union, yes, which has become the de facto political party. It's just a modern day, probably worse version than the political system that created much of this mess in the first place. So it's not surprising at all. All cowards. They are all cowards.
Do you think at some point, if it becomes obvious or continues to be obvious that Brandon Johnson is not viable, even in a crowded field, to make a runoff, much less win re-election, that they discard him for somebody else?
Yeah, it's possible. Stacey Davis Gates has her claws so much into him. It's going to take a lot to, I think, convince her that this guy's a loser. Look, that's why they're banking on the Trump bashing and and demonizing Trump and blaming him for every problem that they've inherited, and so they're going to play that card. They're going to play the ICE card for all it's worth, and so they're going to continue to play that card because look, he's been actually rising in the polls because of that, and so I think it's too early to say that he's not going to run at all. But I will point out that where about 6 months ago he was saying that he wanted to set the record for the longest tenure as mayor. He is now less specific, and he's kind of been saying, well, right now I'm focused on my job. We'll have to wait. So maybe he's keeping his cards open. God knows who they would replace him with.
No, I mean, right. I mean, it's Jackson Potter. I mean, set the record for the longest tenure of any mayor. Wow. Talk about what color is the sky in your world. Oh, my goodness.
He actually did that. But I want to say one more thing. Something that really offended me because is the Chicago Teachers Union now. Not only are they saying that they want to rewrite, they want to relitigate the Civil War, and they claiming that that's what the conservatives want to do. Mm-hmm. But they're also now saying they also had the audacity to say that the Nazis, the Germans, the Nazis learned their philosophy and their approach to segregating people, their discrimination and their oppression of the Jews and others from the United States, from the Southern segregationists. So they're trying really hard to make this connection. Because clearly in the black community is very upset over the fact that they spend billions on migrants, legal migrants, when they're not investing in the black community. So they're trying desperately to basically say that ICE and the treatment of migrants is somehow a parallel or to the treatment of blacks. And now they're claiming that Nazism has its origin in the Confederacy and the southern states, and I mean, and these are all history teachers. It's kind of a scary thought. Think about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I know some of them are black, but they're part of the Confederate Party. By the way, I mean, just a point of order. Paul Vallas, former CEO of CPS. Thanks for joining us as always. Appreciate it, Paul.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You too. And Paul joined us on Chicago's Morning Answer.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank, a bank where relationships still matter. I'm Dan Proft, and I know this because